There are serial killers from every single state, and today I'm telling you guys about the worst serial killer from Illinois. John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago in 1942. He grew up with 2 siblings and an alcoholic, abusive father, and he had a really rough childhood. He was like a chubby, larger kid, and his father constantly would compare him to his sisters and say his sisters were so much better than him, and he was just really hard on him. And his mother would often try to shield him from the abuse and like nastiness that his dad would put on him, but whenever his mom tried to stand up for him, he would call him names. He would call him a sissy or a mama's boy, and then he would say that he was going to wind up being queer because of how soft he was. He also wasn't super popular in school. Again, he was like this larger, awkward kid, and people just had a really hard time connecting with him. When he was 7, he got caught with another little boy like touching a little girl, and his dad beat him super bad for this. And around the same time, John started to get essayed by one of their family friends, and he never told his dad because he was worried his dad would blame John. When he was about 14 all the way through till he was 18, he faced some health issues and he had a heart condition. He actually spent probably about a year in total in and out of the hospital, and his dad always said that he was just making it up because he was a sissy or whatever. So John Wayne Gacy grew up in clearly a very unhealthy home. When he was 18, his dad bought him a car to help him with work, but he was very restrictive about when John could use it. And John secretly made an extra set of keys, saved up some money, and took the car and $136 and moved to Las Vegas to live with his cousin. He worked at a morgue for 3 months as a mortician's assistant. He is caught cuddling the bodies in the coffins, only of the teenage boys, and he was like caressing their bodies and stuff. So he ended up moving back home after being caught for that because that's creepy and weird, and he went back to living with his family in Chicago. After moving back, he ended up enrolling in college, even though he never actually graduated high school. He got a degree in 1963 and also started dating a woman named Marilyn Myers, who was a coworker of his at the time. And they ended up having 2 children together. In 1964 is when they got married, and soon after this, Marilyn's father bought 3 KFC stores in Iowa and asked if John would go manage them. And so John and Marilyn end up packing up and moving to Iowa. They moved to Waterloo, Iowa, and John opened up a club in their basement for all of their employees and coworkers. And he would like constantly invite them over to party and stuff like that. And he would hire men and women and invite men and women over to the parties. But he had a really specific special interest in the young teenagers and early 20-year-old like boys. Like that was what he focused on the most, and he didn't try to hide it really. He'd often get the teenage boys drunk and then try to make like physical advances on them, and if they rejected him, then he would joke that he was trying to test their morals or whatever and play it off like he wasn't actually going to do anything, but if they leaned into it, then he would abuse them. In Waterloo, he also joined a group called the JCs, which is like a business group. I don't fully understand what it was, but it sounds like it's some sort of like business leadership club. And he bonded with a bunch of the other guys in there, and they ended up starting like to do, and they were all highly addicted to different substances and alcohol, and they even were doing wife swapping and hiring and all these different things as like a collective group. August of 1967, John essayed a 15-year-old boy named Donald Voorhees Jr. He was the son of a politician and one of the guys who worked with John in the JC's group. John had lured Donald to his house, saying that he was going to show him some like adult films, and they were all like heterosexual adult films, but he said he was going to show them and teach him some stuff about girls. And he got him drunk and then started to make advances on him, and he told this boy that in order to do things with women, you had to first do things with men. He ended up following this pattern with other boys and young men for months, where he would coerce them into coming over to his house. He'd get them drunk, he'd kind of force them to do stuff and either threaten their job or say they had to like test stuff out, or he would fire them or whatever. So he is like manipulating multiple different people, essaying and assaulting them, and just taking advantage of the fact that they are younger and do not have the same power that he has in these situations. He even started to trick some of them into being part of, quote, homosexual experiences for scientific research, end quote. He would pay them $50 to do things, and he would say it was for research when it really was just these boys. In March of 1968, so about 6 months after he abused Donald Voorhees Jr. told his father what happened, and his dad went to the police, and John was arrested. John obviously denied everything and said that he wanted to take a polygraph test, and many people backed up John, saying he would never do something like this, and that Donald's dad was just trying to blackmail him to take over the JC's group, and that it was actually more of a political move and John would never hurt any young boys. Even with that, John was indicted for sodomy. John ended up hiring someone to go assault Donald's dad, and the guy did, but Donald's dad kind of escaped, called the police, and then John was arrested for that as well. So John ended up facing prison time. He was sentenced to 10 years for that. And at this point, his wife and his kids left him. He never saw them again. Thank God she ran away from him. He was sentenced to 10 years on November 7th of 1968. He only spent about 18 months in prison out of his 10-year sentence before he was released on probation. His probation stated he had to go back to Chicago, and he had a nightly curfew, and then he lived with his mother. Just a side note, his father died while he was in prison. On February 12th of 1971, he was charged with essaying a teenage boy who he said lured him to the car, maybe used chloroform on him, but the boy didn't appear in court, so the charges were dropped. And then in June, he was arrested again and charged because someone said that he flashed a fake police badge, lured him to the car before forcing him to perform certain things on him. And those charges also got dropped because they were able to convince the court that that guy was just trying to blackmail John because he was a successful businessman. So 2 charges pretty quickly after getting out of jail, and somehow his probation officers never heard about this. And that is just ridiculous because after his parole ended a year later, his records were sealed, so literally no one knew about his history. In 1971, with the help of his mom, he bought his own home in Chicago. The address was 8213 West Somerdale Avenue, and this is where he says most of his murders would occur. In August of 1971, he starts dating a girl that he knew from high school. She had 2 kids. They end up living together for years. They get married, and all the while he continues his pattern of coercing boys into doing things for him, whether he's luring them to their garage or their basement, and he just like plays it off with his wife as he's like helping mentor these boys, and meanwhile he was them. In 1973, he and a teenage employee drove down to Florida to look at a property, and it's here where he essayed and the boy. And when they got back, the employee ended up coming back and beating John in the front yard of his home. And John played it off to his wife because she saw it and was like, oh my god, why would that guy?
I am reading How to Read Literature Like a Professor by Thomas Foster, and he has an entire chapter on vampires, and since the book that I'm currently editing has a character in it that is a vampire, I thought it'd be interesting to share a little bit of what he says about vampires in literature. He says, so vampirism isn't about vampires. Oh, it is, but it's also about things other than literal vampirism. Selfishness, exploitation, a refusal to respect the autonomy of other people, just for starters. He also says that even though some stories will just kind of be, you know, the horror thrills about vampires, ghosts and vampire stories are almost never just about ghosts and vampires. Really what they're often about is using other people for your own gain in general. He says you don't need fangs and a cape to be a vampire. The essentials of a vampire story, as we discussed earlier: an older figure representing corrupt, outworn values, a young, preferable, virginal female, a stripping away of her youth, energy, virtue, a continuance of the life force of the old male, the death or destruction of the young woman. And I would say that that's probably more traditional vampire stories, right? Where we have, Dracula, Anne Rice, Interview with the Vampire. A lot of the victims that are mentioned in stories like that are usually female and young, of course. So I do think that that is there. In the works that continue to haunt us, however, the figure of the cannibal, the vampire, the succubus, the spook announces itself again and again, where someone grows in strength by weakening someone else. And I think that this is, technically correct. I do think that this is always going to be an underlying part of a story that would involve a vampire or a succubus, which ironically is also in the book that I'm working on. I think the thing that I am focused on a lot in my own story is still this idea of desire and using people, but more so on the restraint involved in being a creature like that, and wanting to hold on to your morality and not wanting to consider others something that you can just, take from if you're wanting to be part of a society. And, I think that reading stuff like this and kind of knowing the symbology that's there in other works is a good way to deepen my work that I'm currently working on. And, I think it's something that all readers should consider reading something like this. You want to think critically when you're reading, but I do recommend something like this for writers as well, so that you can kind of know what past writing similar to yours was like, and what the focus was on, and then trying to find your own way, your own voice within the never-ending story that is literature, because there is no original story. It's all kind of just speaking to one another, and once you kind of recognize that, it allows you to make stories that can speak to the bigger picture and towards other stories that are out there. And I don't think there's anything wrong with, recognizing those things and really playing with that. So something to consider.
Everything you know about vampires comes from literature. So what were vampires like before the publication of Carmilla and Dracula? I'm Anna, I love gothic literature, and vampires are low-key my special interest. Okay, before we get into the history of vampires, there's an important distinction that I need to make, and that is that I'll be focusing on the Eastern European vampire, aka the one that inspired Dracula. Because it's almost like every culture has their own vampire folklore, but this is just the one that I did the most research on. And in fact, I used the notes for my bachelor's thesis to make this video. So, the word vampire was first popularized in Western Europe in early 19th century, following an account of what was then believed to be mass hysteria in Eastern Europe the century prior. Because in the 18th century, a weird epidemic emerged, symptoms of which included a weak pulse, extreme night terrors, and nightmares that evoked images of the returning dead. And interestingly, the locals immediately attributed this contagion to the undead, which caused them to exhume corpses, stake them, decapitate them, and even sometimes cremate them. Sound familiar? One physician even wrote, and I have the quote here, "Perfectly normal buried dead are arising from their undisturbed graves to kill the living. These too, dead and buried in their turn, arise in the same way to kill yet more people. This occurs by the following means. The dead attack the people by night while they're asleep and suck blood out of them, so that on the third day they all die." Sound familiar? And then in the 19th century, in part due to the Enlightenment, people started looking for scientific reasons to explain this so-called magical plague. For example, in 1847, an article was published that attributed vampirism to premature burial. This article again referenced these epidemics in Eastern Europe and claimed that these alleged vampires were people that were actually in a cataleptic state, if I'm saying that right, or some other physical condition that made them appear dead, which had then been buried alive. This would then also explain why corpses had moved once they were exhumed again, and why some of them were covered in blood because they had injured themselves while trying to escape. Because another part that added to the folklore is that some corpses that were dug up had blood in the corners of their mouth, which they back then called grave eating or menduction, but which we now know is a natural part of the decomposition process. Plus, we also know that Bram Stoker had knowledge of some real-life instances of vampires, including Vlad Tepes, I probably butchered that, but anyway, who ruled what is now roughly Romania, and was the son of Vlad Dracul. And sorry to repeat myself, but sound familiar? And this Vlad guy, I'm not gonna say his name again, was considered a real-life vampire because he had a predilection for impalement in a way that kept his victims alive for days. And in the future, I'll also do a video on the case of Arnold Pole, again these names, which is one of the best documented cases of vampirism before the Victorian era, but I would have to research that one a bit more, so bear with me. Anyway, hope you learned something, and thanks for watching.
One of my followers said that she accidentally matched with a vampire on a dating app. And before you laugh, wait until you hear what actually happened and to her body the morning after the first date. And I'm going to call this woman Erin. She asked me not to use her real name, so that's what we're going to go by. And obviously, I cannot verify what actually happened to her. She doesn't even know what she even believes, but according to Erin, about a year ago, she matched with a man on a dating site who seemed completely normal at first. She actually said he was probably one of the most interesting men that she's ever spoken to. And they spent nearly an entire year talking before they actually met in person. And over those months, she noticed something about him that, he started to change a little bit. His conversations became a little darker, his personality became a little stranger, but weirdly enough, she found herself becoming more attracted to him because of it. And when they finally met face to face, Erin said something happened that she still doesn't completely understand, because that night she invited him home and he refused right off the bat. But somehow, hours later, Erin woke up believing that he'd been standing beside her bed all night long. And Erin said when they originally matched, there was absolutely nothing about this man that screamed vampire or anything. No like ridiculous gothic photographs, no fake fangs, no pictures of him drinking red wine in his cemetery at midnight, no like Edwardian clothing, nothing. He was attractive, he was well-dressed, intelligent, and unusually articulate, she said. And she said he called himself Adrian, but she thinks that it wasn't really his real name. And there was something almost old-fashioned about the way that he communicated, right? They didn't immediately exchange phone numbers right off the bat, and for the first few months, they mostly just emailed. Very long emails and very like in-depth and intense, not the usual dating app small talk. They discussed books, history, music, religion, death, philosophy, places they'd love to travel, places they did travel, things they wanted to experience before they died. And sometimes Adrian would send an email late at night, and Erin, of course, wouldn't see it till the next morning. Now, eventually, they switched to WhatsApp, and that's when she started noticing little things about him. Adrian was almost always available late at night. She could message him at midnight, 1 in the morning, 3 in the morning, and he would answer almost immediately within seconds. During the day, however, sometimes hours would pass and he wouldn't answer, and occasionally an entire day would go by and he wouldn't answer. Erin joked with him once and was like, do you ever sleep? And he would just jokingly reply and be like, oh, just not usually when, everyone else does. So she didn't think anything of it, and he told her he worked very strange hours, but as the months passed, their conversations gradually became a little darker. Not like disturbing, not threatening, just different. Adrian seemed fascinated by mortality, and he once asked Erin whether she thought immortality would be a gift or a punishment. And another night, they were talking and somehow they got onto the subject of memories, and Adrian, said something to Erin like that she actually saved because she thought it was so beautiful. And he basically said like, eventually you stop missing places, you start missing versions of the world that no longer exist anymore. And it's true. Now, Erin asked him what he meant by that, and Adrian just responded with saying something like, hopefully you'll never have to know what I mean. And that was the strange thing really about him, was he would occasionally say something that sounded almost impossible for someone his age to say from experience. He was only I think 22. But then, he'd immediately make a joke and the conversation would move on. Now, they admitted that instead of, she admitted that instead of frightening her, the mystery made him even more attractive. And after nearly a year of talking, they finally agreed to meet. Now, they chose a popular bar in Erin City. It was very public, very busy, and safe. Erin had arrived first, and she remembers being incredibly nervous because, after talking to someone for almost a year and you're finally meeting face to face, it kind of feels like surreal. It's like different from meeting a stranger. And then he walked in, and Erin said she immediately recognized him, and he looked exactly like his photographs and maybe even better in person. But there was one thing that the photographs hadn't captured, and it was his eyes. Erin couldn't explain what it was, but they were so unusual, and she was so attracted. And they weren't like glowing, they weren't red, nothing ridiculous like that. She just said maintaining eye contact with him felt unusually intense. Like when Adrian looked at you, you became extremely aware that he was looking directly at you. And he walked over, he smiled, he said her name, and he gave her a hug, and almost instantly, Erin's anxiety completely disappeared. Adrian was a complete gentleman. He pulled out her chair, he, listened when she spoke, and he remembered tiny details that she'd mentioned months earlier. And she really liked that. He never once behaved aggressive or inappropriately at all. Erin specifically wanted me to emphasize that because she doesn't want this story turned into something that it wasn't, right? She never felt unsafe or anything like that. It was actually quite the opposite, she said. And as the night progressed, Erin became increasingly comfortable with him. almost too comfortable. Hours seem to disappear, and I'm sure we've all been in that before. Now, she remembers looking at the clock at one point and being genuinely confused by how late it actually had become. She'd barely touched her phone, she stopped paying attention to everyone around her, and at some point, the crowded bars seemed to fade into background noise. There was only Adrian, his voice, his eyes, and her, and that's all that she knew. Eventually, the bar began thinning out, and they walked outside together. And before leaving, they gave each other a little kiss goodbye. Nothing dramatic, nothing aggressive, just a short little peck. Erin said that she nervously laughed afterwards, and she asked him, like, hey, do you want to come back to my place and hang out a little bit more? And at this point, this is when it becomes very important, because Adrian, he could have said yes, but she invited him. And instead, his expression completely changed, and he looked at her for several seconds, and he smiled, and he's like, I probably shouldn't. And she's like, why? Okay. And he's like, I just don't think it's a good idea tonight. And then he gave her a kiss on the cheek, and before walking away, he said, but I wish you a great night. And that was it. He just walked away. Erin said that she watched him disappear down the sidewalk, and that was it. He just left, and that should have been the end of it. Now, sometime during the night, Erin started to dream, and she called it to call it a dream almost feels dishonest, basically, because she said she's never experienced anything like that before. It was so vivid and so real. And she was lying in her actual bedroom. She was in the clothes that she went to bed in. Everything was like very real. And then Adrian stepped into view, and he wasn't monstrous or anything. He didn't frighten her. He just walked in very casually, and he looked exactly how he did at the bar that night. And, she said he had a very calm expression, and he sat beside her, and she remembers trying to speak, but she couldn't talk. And I'm sure we've all had that experience in our dream before. You try to move, it feels like your feet are in peanut butter. But then he leaned toward the back of her upper arm, right around her tricep area. And she said she felt this intense burning pain when he did that. And she immediately woke up, she jumped up, and she was like, what the hell? And she was sweating, and she ran into the bathroom to try to, whatever, because it just felt so real, and the pain was still there, even though that she had woken up at this point. And she said when she looked in the mirror at the back of her tricep, she noticed what looked like bite marks. And she's like, there's no way that that's possible. But did it happen? She had this dream that he knelt down and bite the back of her arm. And here she is now, fully awake, woken up from the pain, and she has bite marks on the back of her arm. And I'm going to show you the picture. And again, there's no way for me to verify any of this, so take it as entertainment. But let me know what you guys think in the comments.
Why are there vampire tunnels under downtown Springfield, Missouri? Yes, you heard me right. Beneath these streets, buildings, and sidewalks is a massive underground passage that locals have called the Vampire Tunnels. And unlike a lot of urban legends, the tunnels themselves are absolutely real. But how they got here is only the beginning of the story. Before Springfield existed, Jordan Creek flowed openly through this area. The springs feeding this creek were actually part of what attracted some of Springfield's earliest settlers. But as Springfield grew, Jordan Creek became a problem. It became polluted, and when heavy rains came, it flooded, again and again. Eventually, Springfield decided to do something drastic. They buried it. By the early 20th century, enormous concrete boxes were constructed around portions of Jordan Creek, eventually sending thousands of feet of the creek beneath downtown. According to KSMU's historical investigation, the enclosed section stretched roughly 2/3 of a mile, beginning near Water Street and Main Avenue and continuing eastward. Then, Springfield simply built over it. Streets, businesses, buildings, all while Jordan Creek continued flowing underneath. But decades later, people started finding their way down there, and this is where the story changes. The walls became covered in graffiti, artwork, messages, and some very strange symbols. Missouri State University researchers have actually documented artwork inside these tunnels depicting imagery associated with Christianity, Judaism, Satanism, and other unusual symbols. And those same researchers significantly acknowledge two long-standing Springfield legends associated with this underground world: the Vampire Tunnels and a mysterious place known as Hell's Church. So what exactly was Hell's Church? That question gets even stranger when you understand what's underneath Water Street. In 2025, researchers with the Springfield Greene County Library investigated this exact area, and they discovered that when Springfield buried Jordan Creek, portions of Water Street were essentially built at a higher level over the concrete culvert. That means that some spaces that are basements today were once much closer to street level, and some of the oldest spaces can sit another level beneath them. Think about that. There are places beneath downtown Springfield where the city we walk through today was literally built on top of the city that came before it. Suddenly, stories about hidden rooms and strange gathering places beneath downtown didn't quite seem so impossible. And somewhere among these tunnels, buried spaces, foundations, and forgotten rooms, the story of Hell's Church and the vampire tunnels took over. The story of vampires under Springfield may be legend, but what can be proven is this: Jordan Creek really was buried. A massive tunnel really does exist beneath downtown. People really have explored it. The strange graffiti is really there, and Springfield's underground history is so complicated that researchers are still uncovering pieces of it today. In fact, nearly a century after Springfield buried Jordan Creek, the city has begun doing something remarkable, bringing portions of it back into the daylight. Maybe the most fascinating thing beneath Springfield isn't the legend of vampires. It's that beneath the city everyone sees, there's another Springfield hiding underneath their feet, and some of its stories are still waiting to be uncovered. Thank you for following along with Simmons Travel Adventures as we uncover the stories, myths, legends, places, and hidden history that makes every adventure worth taking.
A follower sent me a story that they heard about a cleaner who lived in Sicily and was hired by an impossibly wealthy family living in a remote mountain estate, but they weren't what they seemed. And being as my family is from Sicily, I enjoyed this one a little bit. Now, as always, there's no way for me to verify any of this, so you decide if it's entertainment or if it really happened. Now, this family, they never went outside during the day, there was no food anywhere inside of the house, and the cleaner was warned to pretend that he didn't notice anything. And it supposedly happened to a cleaner named Niccolò who lived in Sicily. Now, Niccolò had spent years cleaning homes throughout the cities and villages near where he lived, and most of his jobs were pretty ordinary. He would be given an address, a list of rooms, and a few instructions to follow, and he would go about his business. But one morning, his boss sent him deep into the mountains to clean a remote house nearly an hour away from his home. And when Niccolò had arrived, the property looked absolutely abandoned. It was a small farmhouse that looked centuries old, with faded walls, antique furniture, and heavy wooded shutters that were covering every window. But the man who had answered the door didn't really belong there, and he introduced himself as Thomas, and Niccolò described him as unusually tall, extremely pale, and almost unnaturally attractive, he said. Like someone who didn't belong there, they looked like they belonged in a fashion advertisement, instead of standing at a isolated farmhouse in the Sicilian mountains. Now, the strangest part was that the house was already spotless. There was no dust anywhere, there was no clutter, no sign that anyone had actually been living there, kind of different from what the outside showed. And still, Thomas handed Niccolò a list and instructed him to clean every floor, bathroom, and surface inside of the home. Several hours later, more people began to arrive, and Niccolò said that they all looked remarkably similar to Thomas. They were tall, pale, thin, and all of them were almost impossibly perfect, and none of them spoke to him at all, and they simply gathered in the living room and they would just watch him work. When Niccolò finished, Thomas told him that they had another property that needed some more cleaning, and Niccolò had asked them, for the address, and Thomas said, "Don't worry, you'll come with us. We will take you." Niccolò refused, and he had no intention of climbing into any vehicle with strangers and disappearing deeper into the mountains. But as he was packing up his equipment, his boss had called him, and he sounded absolutely frightened and unusually serious, the boss. And he told Niccolò that these clients were offering the company an enormous contract, and that if he refused to go with them, he would lose his job and his boss would lose the contract. So Niccolò reluctantly climbed into their SUV, and they drove for nearly 2 hours through isolated mountain roads before arriving at this enormous estate that was hidden among orchards and valleys. And the main house had been built sometime in the 1600s. He could just tell There was a sign outside that pretty much stated when the estate was built, and that's how we knew. Now, it looked more like a monastery or ancient manor than a private residence. Inside were long hallways, a ceremonial dining room, and more than a dozen bedrooms and heavy wooden shutters that were again covering every single window. And the family offered Niccolo full-time work to stay there, and his instructions were pretty simple: clean only the rooms that he was assigned. Never enter the other buildings on the property. Never touch anything inside of the room that they would call, or that he would soon come to learn as the laboratory. And never ask any questions. Niccolo, of course, accepted, wanting to keep his job, and the money was too good to refuse. But over the following weeks, he began noticing things that absolutely disturbed him. The family was almost never seen during daylight, and whenever one of them entered a room, they immediately closed every door and shutter as soon as they would enter. And even during the intense Sicilian summer, they wore dark, thick clothing that covered every inch of their bodies. And he described it as like long, thick wool. And in my mind, I pictured it like a herringbone suit type of material. Now, Niccolo never saw them eat. The refrigerators were always empty. The cupboards contained no food. And yet, after certain nights, Niccolo would arrive to find the dining hall filled with dirty plates and long tables set for dozens of guests. But the plates never contained any scraps or morsel, whatever, of food. Only this dark, sticky stains on it. And then there was the laboratory, and it resembled a private medical room with reclining chairs and metal instruments, mirrors, and equipment that Niccolo didn't even recognize. He said it looked very alien-like and foreign to him. And he was ordered to clean the chair and the floor beneath it, but never to touch anything else. Like those, it was very specific. And one afternoon, while cleaning that room, he heard something moving directly above him, and it sounded like heavy knocking mixed with the growl of an animal. But when Niccolo later cleaned the bedrooms upstairs, he found them to be empty. But he knew that there was something up there. And the most frightening incident happened after a large gathering at the estate. Niccolo had arrived late that morning because his mother was actually ill, so he had to go back into town. So Thomas ordered him to remain at the estate several hours after sunset to make up for the time lost. And by 10:30 that night, Niccolo was still cleaning the Great Hall. That was when the family began appearing, and he said they didn't arrive like normal party guests or for like a normal party. He said they just appeared. No vehicles came up the gravel road to the house. No doors opened, but yet one by one, people began walking into the Great Hall from somewhere deeper within the estate. And of course, there was Thomas, the near 7 foot tall man, and that Niccolo had seen before. There were several women, a few other older men, a few younger men, nearly 20 people in total, and every one of them were pale, elegant, and very silent. Niccolo had already cleaned every room in the house, and he knew that none of them had been inside at that time. So where had they come from? And that was when he remembered the abandoned stables that were behind the manor. Niccolo had noticed that after sunset, people were constantly walking between the house and those buildings outside. The stables had no horses, no windows, no visible electricity, and he had even been strictly forbidden from going anywhere near them. Like that was the one part of the property that he was not allowed to clean or go near whatsoever. Now, Niccolo became convinced that there was something underneath the estate, maybe like an underground section of the property where the family remained during the day, but he never tried to prove it, and he never opened the stable doors or anything. He never searched for another entrance. He simply just cleaned what he was told to clean, and he pretended not to notice anything unusual like his instructions told him. Now, Niccolo eventually left the job, and he never claimed to have seen, fangs or anything supernatural like that. And he never saw anyone drink anything unusual, and he never witnessed anything that could prove that the family was any type of level of supernatural at all. But he said that after months of working inside that estate, he became certain of one thing, and that was those people were not living like normal human beings. They avoided sunlight, they never ate any food, they appeared only after dark, and somewhere beneath those abandoned stables, the family was hiding something that they were willing to pay a great deal of money to keep a secret. So, Niccolo said the reason he remained safe was simple. He understood the unspoken rule of the house: clean their rooms, keep your eyes lowered, and no matter what you see, pretend you didn't see it. So, let me know what you guys think in the comments. If you've heard about this, if you're from there, or you have family that are from there and you've heard it once before, or if you've heard something similar like this in another part of the country or another part of the world. Let me know. Okay, so this story was sent to me by a follower, and it apparently originally came from an old internet forum that doesn't even exist anymore. And the post had vanished years ago, but after reading it, I genuinely understand why it did. So this is part 1, and part 2 is already up and posted, so I highly recommend that you go check it out. Now, according to the woman who wrote this account, she was 17 years old during the summer of 1973, and she was living in northern Idaho. And at that time, she was working as an intern for the U.S. Forest Service, helping plant trees and clear fire breaks. And during an especially dry summer, she said it was all hands on deck. And that's when she met him. She said a wildfire crew had come in from out of town and they were temporarily on standby. And among the firefighters was the most beautiful man that she said she had ever seen. He was very tall. He had long, perfect blonde hair. Everything about him was perfectly symmetrical, whether it be his face or his body proportions. She said he was just perfect. And he had this very strange, thick European accent that she couldn't quite place. And she said it sounded like almost like a combination of all European nations, if that makes sense. She said he looked almost unreal, like somebody pretending to be human. And his name was supposedly Manfred Kirschner. And according to her, he eventually noticed her too while she was staring at him, and he started to talk to her. And whenever the crews would go on break or come into town, he would always find her and talk to her. So before long, they started going on dates. But there were always these like little strange things about him that started to come up almost immediately. He would only meet late at night, and it was typically after 10 p.m. And during dinner, he never ate, never drank, not once. She never seen him take any morsel of food. And she said every single time that they went out, he would encourage her to order food while he just sat there, and he would drink wine occasionally, and he would just watch her. And at first she thought, it was charming, but then eventually she started to get kind of creeped out about it. She's like, dude, you're really just going to sit here and watch me eat? So she also noticed that he never touched her, not even in like a flirty physical way, never even tried kissing her, which she found strange because she admitted that she was very attracted to him. And then one night she invited him back to her apartment. And now, according to her, the second that they sat down together inside, the atmosphere completely changed. As she said, she felt like she was sitting with something that wasn't him anymore. And she said he suddenly became very quiet and composed and almost like nervous. And then he looked at her directly and he said, I want to tell you the truth about myself and about my life. And at first she thought, he was going to admit he was married and, he was hiding something or hiding something illegal. But instead, he calmly explained that he was from Germany and that he was over 400 years old. And then he said something that made her question her life choices at that point. And he said, I'm a vampire. And now, according to her, he was not joking. He was dead serious. She said she could feel the vibe in the room. This was definitely not a joke. So go check out part 2. It is already posted. First, before I tell this story, I need to say that we just hit 200,000 followers. 200,000 people that are following my page for stories about paranormal, strange history, unexplained encounters, and things that probably shouldn't exist. And I genuinely cannot thank all of yous enough. So I wanted to give you something special for the 200K. And since I know that you have this slight obsession with old vampire stories, I saved this story for this particular moment that was told to me as a kid by my family who migrated over here from Sicily. And what I have is an old story supposedly passed down from Sicily nearly 200 years ago. And again, I can't verify if any of this actually happened. Stories like this survive through retellings, and details, inevitably change over time. But if even the basic story of it is true, there was something wandering the Sicilian countryside in the early 1800s that people were absolutely terrified of. And strangely enough, the man at the center of this story apparently never tried to hide who or what he actually was. Now, the story supposedly begins sometime in the early 1820s in a small country community in Sicily. And at the time, traveling between villages could mean hours on foot or horseback through isolated farmland and mountain roads. And according to the legend, people traveling one particular road began talking about this one man. Nobody knew his name, nobody knew where he lived, but eventually everyone would describe him almost in the exact same way. He was always well dressed, even in the Sicilian summer heat, in suits and everything, incredibly pale, not sickly pale. They just described his skin as almost completely drained of color, like a gray, ashy color. But the strangest thing about him was his behavior. He would apparently stand beside the road after sunset and politely ask travelers, "Hey, may I walk with you?" And that was it. And he never threatened anyone. He never chased anyone. He simply would ask permission to accompany them on their journey. And according to this story, the locals eventually developed one very important rule in regard to this man. And that is never say yes. Because, people who allowed the stranger to walk beside them reportedly became extremely ill afterward. And one account described a farmer who encountered him while returning home late one evening. And the stranger appeared beside a stone wall, and he had asked the farmer if he could accompany him. The farmer politely agreed, and for nearly 20 minutes the two supposedly walked together. They spoke about life, past experiences, whatever. The farmer later said the man was extremely polite, educated, soft-spoken, but something bothered him about the man, and it was their footsteps. The farmer could hear his own boots hitting the dirt and stones and whatnot, but the stranger walking beside him made almost no sound at all, and eventually they reached the road leading toward the farmer's property. The stranger stopped, and he just said, "You have been a very kind man to me. Thank you." He reached out, shook the farmer's hand, and he went about his day. Well, the farmer claimed the man's skin was so cold that he immediately pulled away in shock, and when he looked back, to look back at him before walking away, the stranger was already long gone. The farmer returned home, and by morning he was violently ill. His wife supposedly noticed something else on him, and it was 2 tiny marks beneath his jaw, like right about there. And within days, the farmer could barely stand, but he did survive. And when people would ask him, exactly what happened that night, he kept repeating something very strange, and it was, he would say that the man never attacked him. He couldn't remember being bitten or what happened, but he remembered becoming incredibly tired while they were walking, almost like he was falling asleep while still moving. And he remembered the stranger, telling him, "Don't stop walking. Let's just keep going." And after that, stories about the pale man became more and more famous and disturbing. Animals were supposedly found drained and strangely, out. People reported seeing this figure standing among vineyards, after dark. And women supposedly looked from their window late at night and they saw him standing outside of her house, just staring up at them. And when she crossed herself, in the sign of the cross, the man smiled and then he just walked away. But the creepiest part of the whole story supposedly happened several years later. And it was this local man who had passed away unexpectedly. And when his family opened an old family burial chamber to place his remains inside, they found another body instead. A man that nobody recognized. And he was, dressed in clothing that appeared older than the recently deceased man. His body was very pale, his hands were folded across his chest, and according to the legend, there was almost no decomposition at all, no stage of it. The family immediately contacted others from the village, and several elderly residents came to see the body. And one of them supposedly backed away, the moment that he saw the man's face, because decades earlier, he had a strange encounter on a roadside outside of the village. And it was a very tall, pale man who had asked him one simple question: "May I walk with you on your journey?" Same exact thing as this guy. And according to the legend, they sealed the burial chamber and they refused to disturb the body anymore. But here's the detail that really makes this story stick with me. Years later, when someone supposedly entered the chamber again, the unidentified body was gone. No disturbed stones, no broken entrance, nothing stolen, just an empty space where the pale stranger had once been lying, kind of like the Carter brothers in New Orleans. And after that, the sightings stopped, at least in the village. But similar stories began appearing elsewhere on the island and in other parts of other countries. Stories about an unusually pale man walking rural roads after sunset, never chasing anyone, never forcing his way inside, never attacking openly, just patiently waiting for someone traveling alone and asking, "May I walk with you on your journey?" And again, maybe it's, simply a Sicilian folklore, just a story that was told to me and many others as a kid. Maybe it was illness, superstition, and generations of storytelling eventually transformed an ordinary man into something supernatural. Or maybe 200 years ago, they encountered something that they didn't have another name for, something that we would eventually come to realize today as a vampire. Either way, if you're ever walking an old road in Sicily after sunset and a pale stranger steps out of the darkness and politely asks you if they can join you, I'd probably keep walking alone, keep it at that. Well, probably knowing me, I'd probably say, "Sure, bro, join." And again, guys, thank you so much for the 200,000 followers. Seriously, you guys have allowed me to tell the kinds of strange stories I've always loved and to share it with you, and we're only getting started. Let me know what you guys think in the comments.